Well, good afternoon, good morning to all of you joining us today. Thanks so much. I'm Eric Lynn Greenberg. I'm an assistant professor of political science at MIT. And on behalf of my good friends and co-authors, Dr. Jackie Schneider and Dr. Reed Pauly, we want to welcome you to the third and final installation of our talks on wargaming. So over the past few weeks, we've had a number of talks based in part on this article that we published in the European Journal of International Relations. And we've spent the first talk discussing wargames as historical data, looking at wargames throughout history and how we can learn from using historical wargame data. We had another session that looked at wargame data and social science, and so how researchers can use wargames as a method of generating data. And today I'm really excited to turn the floor over to my colleague, Dr. Jackie Schneider, and our distinguished panel to talk about wargames and their use in national security. Thanks so much for joining us today.
Thank you, Eric. And I am just so thrilled to have with us this extraordinary panelists. So brief introductions, because I don't even think these folks need introductions, but just in case. So we have with us Mr. Bob Work, who is the 32nd Deputy Secretary of Defense. Dr. Micah Zenko is the Director of Research and Learning at the McChrystal Group, and Dr. Stacie Pettyjohn, who is a Senior Fellow and Director of the Defense Program at the Center for a New American Security. Now I'm going to jump right into questions because some of you may have felt like your ears were burning during the previous sessions, and I want to get straight to questions that came up in the previous discussions. So, Bob, your name has come up quite a bit in the previous conversations. And that was really because as Deputy Secretary of Defense, you made a really large effort towards integrating and improving war games across the Department of Defense. And so I wanted to get from your perspective as the Deputy Secretary of Defense, kind of what role do you think war games play in defense decision-making? And what were the efforts that you started under your guise as the Deputy Secretary of Defense to try and integrate and improve war games within the DoD?
Thanks, Jackie. It's great to be here this afternoon. Good afternoon, everybody, and everyone who's listening. Wargaming has traditionally been an extremely important part of Department of Defense planning, programming, even budgeting. Generally, what I'll talk about are the times that war games have really been used in periods of enormous technological or international change to try to give a sense of what may be coming or what may be possible. Those in the Department of Defense probably think of the interwar period as just a wonderful time for wargaming because there was so much going on. In the United States Navy, for example, they were planning for a potential war against the Imperial Empire of Japan. And they had to figure out how to get the fleet across the Pacific. How would they sustain the fleet across the Pacific? What type of operations would be in the Pacific? At the same time, there was a tremendous technological change, primarily in bringing aviation into the fleet. So throughout, from about 1920 all the way up until 1941, the Navy would do war games every single year. And at the end of the war, the Navy would say, look, nothing surprised us in the Pacific with the exception of kamikazes. War games illuminated everything that happened. In the 1990s, in my own experience, at the end of the Cold War, we knew things were going to change immensely. And in 1992, the Office of Net Assessment, under the late great director Andrew Marshall, started a war game called 20XX. And he called it 20XX because he said, look, technology is really going to change the way wars are fought, the character of war. How will it do so? And he didn't want to debate, well, the change is going to occur in 2020 or 2030 or 2010. He just called it 20XX. And he said, how will warfare change? And during this War Games series, which started like in 1992, 93, really started humming along in 1995 and ended just before 9/11, I would say that it pretty much nailed what is referred to as the precision strike regime. You know, the combination of guided munitions and battle networks. And it pretty much nailed what was going to happen. It foresaw the development of hypersonic missiles. It foresaw the development of all kinds of different unmanned systems and drones. It talked about the different types of operations that would be required. And if you look at the 2001 QDR, Quadrennial Defense Review, and the 5 or 6 operational challenges that Secretary Rumsfeld said, look, we don't know when we're going to have another peer competitor, but we have to plan as though we will have one, and here are the operational challenges we're going to have to solve when that occurs. Those were all drawn from a decade long of wargaming. And I would say if we had followed them, we'd be in a lot better position today than we are now. But 9/11 happened, and it kind of took us in a different direction. So war games are so important in the Department of Defense. They illuminate all sorts of new concepts of operations, new types of technologies, how the technologies will change the character of war. So as a deputy secretary, having gone through the 90s with 20XX, I was determined to try to revitalize wargaming in the department, which had kind of gone quiescent over the period of the times of the wars in the Middle East. So I really wanted to ramp things up, and we tried our best to do so.
Well, I want to follow up on this before I move to our other panelists, because one of the things that we've talked a lot about in the other sessions, including our session on the use of wargaming as a historical piece of data, is the initiative that you put forth to create a DoD Wargame Repository. I was kind of tangentially involved in this because part of this effort was happening at the Naval War College while I was there, but I was interested kind of from your perspective, what were the challenges you found when you were trying to build a repository? And maybe if you could talk to the audience a little bit about kind of what you were trying to build and what you thought the purpose of putting all this data together was. And then, secondarily, is there a role that academic institutions might be able to play in compiling this kind of data and analyzing DoD war games?
Sure. Yeah, one of the key outputs of the Department of Defense is the defense program and budget. The capabilities that we need, the capabilities, how much of the capabilities we want to buy, how much capacity we want to buy. And as the deputy secretary, I would sit in an organization or a meeting called the Deputies Management Action Group. And the vice chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff and the deputy would sit at the head of the table, and we would talk about tactical aviation, for example. And we would debate the type of capabilities we needed, the type of capabilities we needed to get rid of, how much to buy, what to buy. We would have DMAGs on research and development, for example. And I was constantly surprised at the lack of decision quality data that a senior leader in the Department of Defense has available to help make decisions. I knew war games were going on in the department, but I had no idea what the war games were telling us. And so the whole purpose of the repository was, let's have everybody who's doing war games to report the outcomes of their games, put it in a repository, which was held by CAPE, the Cost Analysis and Program Evaluation Directorate. And they would bring in the results to the DMAG and say, look, a common theme across all of the war games is we are really bad at contested logistics. So we need to do something better in contested logistics. We need to have better capabilities. We need to have better capacities. So that was the whole purpose of the repository. It was actually to get the results of war games in front of senior leaders who, up to that point, knew that war games were going on, but had no idea what they were telling us, if anything. So, yes, by all means, I think academia could help. The way I would think about it is the people who report the results of war games, it would be great if there was an outside, independent kind of look at the war games and said, yes, I think you can make this determination based on the war game, or this determination is a stretch, and this determination you have absolutely no evidence for. So academia could really help in that regard. And there's all sorts of problems. I think the repository still works, is still in play. I don't exactly know how the Department of Defense is using it. But one of the problems we would have is if a war game revealed a capability or capacity that was not consistent with the services program, it could be internally depressed or not brought forward. And that would be another thing that the academics could help on and say, hey, there's a real good insight here, but it's not getting up to the leaders. It's being squashed inside of the service bureaucracy. So that would be one thing that I would hope that the department is looking at and making sure isn't happening. So for example, if a war game said, look, by 2045, we need to have completely flip the ratio of unmanned squadrons and manned squadrons, crewed and uncrewed systems. And perhaps the Chief of Staff of the Air Force thinks that's too aggressive, that 2045 is too soon. He doesn't think he would be able to do it. Doesn't have enough money to even get there, even if he or she agreed to it. So war games can't tell you the answer, but they can help inform an answer that senior leaders can then pursue.
I think that brings up an important concept that maybe is a little foreign to academics, which is the idea of the sponsor and the role that the sponsor plays in driving sometimes the outcomes of the games, but also the way in which the outcomes are reported, and potentially whether those outcomes are reported at all. So Stacie, I want to turn to you because you before working at CNAS, you led the Wargaming Center at RAND, which for those of you who don't know, it's what's called a FFRDC, federally funded research something center. And so the idea, the point is, RAND is running games that it's asked to run by sponsors from the US government. So I want to get your perspective, and you're also an academic, so you've kind of seen it across the gamut. You now build your own games at CNAS that some have sponsors and some do not. So can you discuss and explain what the role of the sponsor is in game design and analysis? And then how does not having a sponsor change the way you think about designing and analyzing games?
Thanks, Jackie. Federally funded research and development center. And we created the gaming center at RAND because of Bob's memo back in the day. So all comes full circle here. Sponsors are a very fraught topic and one that can be very challenging as a game designer because you have to work intimately with your sponsor to understand what they're trying to learn or what their goals are with the game. And that needs to shape everything else that you do. And it sounds really trite, but it's actually true. And sponsors often can shape the game in good and bad ways. And they can just be challenging because they can change their minds across the course of when you are preparing for a game, sometimes at the last minute. I think because games are events in a real place and time, they think that they can shift it later, even though you've been designing and doing all this work. And it's like, well, let's change the scenario about 24 hours before you're planning to execute the game, which can throw you for a bit of a loop. But the most important thing is understanding what they want to learn and then trying to whittle that down to a few objectives that are not really in tension with each other, which in and of itself is a pretty monumental task, because oftentimes the services in different parts of the Department of Defense really like to have, exhaustive lists of learning objectives that are multiple pages long. And it's like, no, let's take it up to the right level of what you can actually confidently say that you can learn from a game and what you can't. And some of my former colleagues at RAND used to always say, you shouldn't be getting a precise number from a game. You might find that you need more of certain types of precision guided weapons, but a game's not going to tell you that you need 723 of those to win the war against China or Russia or whoever the adversary might be in that situation. So understanding what a sponsor wants should really drive how you design the game and allow you to get at the learning objectives. But sponsors also can impose themselves and try to use games to further their own sort of bureaucratic interests. And then there are practical considerations that get involved. They want 200 people to come play in your game. Well, you never want to really have 200 people to game. It's unwieldy, and it assures that you're going to have some players that are not engaged and that are going to cause problems because they're bored. So there are many sort of practical things: where you hold it, who's playing, who's involved. The players are really important, because selecting who's going to be there, your game is really, I say, and we might talk about this later, but your game is as good as the players that you have. If you have folks who don't know what they're doing, and they're supposed to be developing military concepts of operations and, responding in a dynamic way to a thinking adversary to win on the battlefield, and it is someone who doesn't really know the difference between a stealthy 5th generation fighter and a 4th generation fighter that is less capable, you might not get the best result. So players, and then there's of course the results. RAND, like all of the FFRDCs, is independent, and so is CNAS as a think tank. And we have always maintained our own right to independently determine what the results are. But that doesn't mean that the sponsor pays attention to them, and there's many ways to bury those results, which unfortunately can happen far too often if you report back things that they don't want to hear, that go against their parochial interests, against their preferred sort of acquisition programs or concept of operations. It's not always easy telling a sponsor that their ideas need more work, to put it nicely, or that they're not particularly good. Perhaps there are escalation risks associated with certain concepts that they're very fond of. And so from start to finish, working with a sponsor can be very rewarding, and you can learn a lot when you have very interested, good ones that understand what games are good for and what they're not good for. But you can also have sponsors who don't understand the strengths and weaknesses of wargaming and get too involved and try to shape the outcomes because they're trying to move certain bureaucratic battles in one direction or another. And not having a sponsor is a very liberating experience. You get to decide what you want to learn from the game. So it becomes a little bit more like a pure research project that you're undertaking, where you determine what the question is and what you want to understand. And then you're freed up of some of those the interference that sponsors sometimes throw your way, and to design the game in a way that you think is most sound, most aligned with good research design principles, and the way that you think will produce the best results that you have the most confidence in. And that's great. I think that oftentimes, because games with sponsors, especially like the Title X games the services run, are really big elaborate affairs, the stakes are very high, and I would prefer to run smaller games with fewer people where you are free to learn and see what actually emerges from the game instead of sort of having to orchestrate this big, elaborate show.
Hey, Jackie, can I jump in real quick?
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah, I thought Stacie was very careful and very, very, very good in describing some of the issues. And I don't think either she or I would want to say that the services are, bad actors in this. This would be another place where academics could help. As Stacie said, the services run Title X war games. These are war games that are designed to show how the force they are building will operate in the future. So it is very much what the Title X games are designed to do is to provide evidence that the way a service is headed is the right way. And that's good. You need that because the services have the Title X responsibility to organize, train, and equip, and we want to know if what they're doing is going to be effective, or we would like to have an idea on what they're building is effective. But it's very, very easy for the sponsors then to look at non-Title X war games and look at results that don't necessarily line up with the Title X game to then try to intervene and say, hey, could you do it this way, or could you, do that way? And that's, again, where I think academics could help. If they were kind of monitoring the wargaming enterprise, they would observe the Title X games. They'd be able to make determinations on whether the Title X games were realistic, well-run, whether the conclusions that came from them were credible, and then compare them with what was happening to non-Title X games and identify to the senior leaders in the department, hey, we have a disconnect here. There are some games that are showing something that deviates from the Title X game. And so, like the Army in the 1990s ran a wargaming series called The Army After Next. It was ginormous. I mean, I agree 100% with Stacie. You don't want to have a lot of people, but they would have like 200 or 300 or 400 people at these games. And they would have people playing the president, and the Secretary of State, and the Secretary of Commerce. I mean, it was unbelievable. But it was really, really an interesting set of games. In the first game, the acting president did not want to fight a war against Russia because he was afraid of nuclear escalation. And the whole purpose of the war game was to tell the Army if their new operational concepts or future operational concepts had anything to do with it. So the war gamers, the white cell had to go to the president and say, look, pull the trigger, push the button. We have to have a war. And of course, that wouldn't happen in real life.
Well, I think Eric and I have both run our own war games without sponsors. And I think it gives you a lot of freedom substantively to ask questions that might be threatening to what kind of service interests are, but it also allows freedom methodologically. So Eric and I both employ things that look like experiments. I tried multiple times to get some of our sponsors at the Naval War College to buy into this experiment thing, and they were not about it. So I think there's also kind of room methodologically that not having a sponsor can provide, but it also means you have to generate your own funding, which can, there are places like the Army, Stratcom, all these places have a lot more resources than academics. Now I want to move to Micah, because Micah, we've spent a lot of time in this conversation addressing what exactly a war game is. And in both the first and the second sessions, Eric and Reed and our panelists spent a lot of time delving into like what a war game is and what a war game isn't, and whether the definition is important. Now you do work that we could call kind of more about red teaming. So can you explain a little bit about, what is red teaming? And then how is this related or not related to wargaming?
Yeah, thank you so much. I'd be careful to call myself the person who can speak for red teaming, because red teamers, despite being open, divergent thinkers, tend to be very parochial, and they actually have very closed-minded ideas of what official red teaming is and isn't. So this is one person's opinion. For me, red teaming is really just an industry challenge agnostic way to change the frame by which groups and judgments make decisions. That's all it is. Basically, if you look at the process by which any group forms an opinion and makes a choice, there are a range of individual biases and organizational pathologies built into all those processes. Red teaming is an attempt to change the frame to mitigate against those biases that are most probable to introduce suboptimal decision-making, especially when dealing with strategic, complex, or multi-stakeholder choices, ones that have long-term impacts, affect a range of different people. It's all based on the central premise that groups who are tasked to develop a plan, whether that's an operational plan to go to war, to put a new product out in the marketplace, to come up with a new process for everything you can imagine, they're the least likely to see it divergently, or the least likely to identify shortcomings with the plan, because they identify with it. It is part of their obligation and their responsibility. And just as if you asked me to describe how great a dancer I am, how attractive I am, you shouldn't believe what I tell you, because I have no reason to be honest with you. So similarly, the people who write the plan, you can't trust them to tell you the truth about what are its shortcomings. By design, blind spots are unforeseeable, and they exist in all of us. If we could see them, you would have sort of perfect omniscient cognition. So for example, a lot of the frames that we try to change have to do with hierarchy, with groupthink, with presentism. So if you have people who are over obsessed with the near term, who have strong influence of senior leadership, who have low degrees of psychological safety, you have to change the frame through which they see the problem. You do that through things like awarding participants anonymity, through giving them very specific structure through which they work through a problem set, through engaging in visioning exercises to get them to think over the horizon, to force them to assume the roles or the identity of stakeholders who will be impacted by the decision. And so this is a sort of a facilitated structural approach that we take to everything from the smallest discrete problem set up to full scale. I mean, just this morning I was doing this for a large amalgam of emergency management responders, thinking through some of the consequences of emergency management response, which is by design novel, complex, and involve lots of stakeholders. So again, it's just a changing the frame through which groups and judgments, groups makes judgments and decisions.
Now, you mentioned a little bit about the type of people that usually are on red teams and the type of people that you're recruiting to run through these exercises. And this is something that actually comes up in wargaming quite a bit as well. And so I was interested from your perspective, like how important is it to generate the right people, the right individuals, and for red teaming and then for kind of scenario development and wargaming? Can we just grab anybody, or are there certain characteristics or knowledge that we need to look for?
Yeah, I think it varies again by you have to start with doing a needs assessment of what are the biases and the pathologies that are most prevalent within this organization. I actually think you can do red teaming with everybody. It is often the case that we look for people who have special subject matter expert knowledge, or you want people with certain specific experiences, and then you have them participate in some of these facilitated exercises. Actually, I like to empower people at the front edge. People who are young enough, they don't know any better, old enough, they don't care anymore. It's this sort of random composition of diversity that leads to higher, and I would say more unique insights. Most red team exercises take one cohort of leaders or one cohort of people at the next layer down. So like GS 14s, 15s, 06s, and they say like, okay, you're gonna be the red team. Well, undoubtedly, these are peers who are already networked with each other. They've gone through the same professional military education experiences. They've all read the same doctrine. They have the same received set of beliefs about what military conflict should look like. And they don't perceive problems differently almost ever. So you have to get people who have different experiences and outcomes, who have seen failure, and who are willing to be part of this process. There's also the larger sort of institutional issues of incentivizing it, rewarding it, buying off people's time, because this takes time. But I think the diversity of composition is the most important aspect of it. And then some people can't do this. They can't envision, for example, the United States failing. They literally can't imagine like US soldiers dying. And so they shouldn't participate in these sorts of situations. But in general, most people can do this if you have strong facilitation and an inclusive environment.
Stacie, I want to pivot right back to you, because this is another instance where your ears may have been burning the last few weeks, because you are a co-author on a very influential discussion in science. Our previous panelist, Andrew Reddy, him and his team had written a really interesting article in Science that was arguing actually for larger N war games and for iteration. And even the use of computer-based samples in order to increase the overall N. To get back to what Micah was saying, in order to create like a randomization of characteristics. And this is something that we see in social science a lot, is this idea that having a random but large sample increases the generalizability of your outcomes. But you guys you and your co-authors in the Science article make a different argument about the importance of the right sample. And so can you talk through this debate about between large N war games and expert samples? And then if you don't mind, because just take a really big chew on this, if you can come back to not just sample, but iteration and what role iteration plays in war games.
Sure, I'll take a crack at it. Let's see. So I agree with Micah that diversity is a good thing to have, and when you're looking at different players and who's playing, who your sample is, who you're drawing from, sometimes there are specific characteristics you want for red team players in particular, those that are intended to challenge. You want them to understand whatever actor they're representing, to have a basic understanding of their strategy, their capabilities. But you also really want some people that just don't like to lose and are willing to go win at all costs, because they're going to find the weaknesses in the other team's actions and in their strategy, and they're going to try to exploit them. And that helps you to identify those vulnerabilities and ultimately to come up with stronger plans and courses of action within a fight. So the sampling issue is one where it is a bit of, I think, a debate between, like so many things on war games, the practitioner side and who focus on policy analysis, and the academics who are really interested in trying to conduct causal inference. And when you're doing that, you want random samples, you want large samples, you have increased confidence in the results, you can run statistical analysis on them. When you're running games for policy analysis, you typically want players that have enough of an understanding of the topic that you're studying that they can make informed decisions. This is sort of the bar that I've settled on. They don't necessarily have to be experts. They don't have to have sat on the National Security Council. That's a very small sample, right? People who have held top jobs in different governments, but you want them to be able to make informed decisions. If they're making stupid decisions, then your game results really aren't going to have much validity. So you either have to build a game that helps non-expert people make informed decisions by providing them with information in a way that they can process and use in a reasonable amount of time, or they have to actually just really have that expertise at their fingertips and be able to call on it. But when I run games for policy analysis, we often want players with different types of expertise. In the military, everybody has very narrow specialties that they're very deep in, but they don't necessarily understand how a soldier wouldn't understand how an airman or is going to fight. And you need to bring in people with different types of requisite knowledge so that they can make all of the decisions in a reasonable manner, a reasonably informed manner. So I tend to think that there are only so many people that are available for certain types of games that are focused on either wargaming, because most people don't actually understand how militaries operate or plan to operate. If you're making decisions that are supposed to represent senior decision makers, you know, the threshold's probably different. And that I find that it's really important that if you don't have people who are good, who understand it, and who make informed, good choices in a game, that is really your critical variable. To blur the two things, the people who play are the thing that makes games different from any other method, and the decisions that they make are the most important thing. So if they're not able to make good decisions, I don't know how the game has much validity. So I tend to come down on the side of you need to have informed players or build a game that can provide players with information they need, which is hard to do because you try to simplify things without dumbing them down, where they're just abstract representations. Iteration is important for both, but for different reasons, slightly different reasons. I mean, in both cases, it increases your confidence in the findings. You can observe trends, and you can see where certain commonalities come out. But for policy analysis, you just never run the games that many times. I think the most games I've ever run was with Rand in defending the Baltics, and that was probably like 30. And over the course of many years, because most of the policy games end up taking up several days of people's time, and that's really hard to get, and that's something that's very precious, and that can be a real impediment to actually running the game many times. But ultimately you do want to iterate, so you can better determine and assess whether a game's results are some weird anomaly because you had this crazy player one day, or whether they actually are represent something that you expect to happen in the real world and that you think have some more generalizability.
I will say the last 3 weeks to a month has emphasized to me that sometimes you also need the crazy player in the room. Because if I've run a game 580 times and 570 times, my players all choose kind of a standard basket of options, but 10 times my players choose something outside the standard, I need to recognize that 10, while unlikely, is within the realm of possibilities. And I think that's something that actors like Putin actually emphasize about war games, is that having the right sample can also include having the crazies in your in your sample. So I want to take one of the questions from the audience, because I think that it actually works really nicely, and ask all of the panelists, maybe starting with Micah. You know, John Scott Logal, who was one of our previous panelists, is joining us today as watching the webinar, and he asked about how you assess the effectiveness of war games or series of war games. And I think also this is something that sticks with me a lot, is how you think about the effectiveness of red teaming. And how does a wargaming center or someone who's running a red team analysis, how do they know how well they're doing? How do they measure their own effectiveness? So I want to go ahead and start with Micah and then move to Bob.
Yeah, I think this is not just something that deals with red teaming or wargaming. Is how do you demonstrate the utility of any preventative measure? Like, that is always the inherent challenge. And it's the reason why preventative activities and preventative thinking gets pushed to the side. You know, Gresham's law, long-term strategic planning gets displaced by near-term priorities. So if we're all obsessed with the tyranny of the inbox because it is something actionable, something that's tangible, we can do something about and get credit for today, we overfocus on it. And nobody's ever judged on their future performance because it hasn't happened yet. So how do you demonstrate to somebody that there is utility for any preventative thinking whatsoever? And I think you have to lay some very clear benchmarks with any sponsor or whoever the point of contact is who gets the process ongoing. Are you looking to identify specific vulnerabilities in any product, process, plan, idea, or game? You can work with people in advance to get a sense of what those are, what is the pain threshold, and you can tailor any sort of exercise or war game to make sure that those are being touched. You know, a lot of the war games or the red teams that I do are really as much designed to force inclusion and empowerment among a group of people, and especially among emerging leaders who rarely get the opportunity to weigh in on strategic choices. And we measure pre and post event, like net promoter score stuff, like, did you feel like this was a good use of your time? It's always the case. They always wish it was longer. And they always say, we never have conversations like this. So it's really the opportunity for people to have white space strategic conversations that they otherwise never have. That has a longer term impact. People feel invested in, they feel included. And organizations that tend to do these activities have higher levels of engagement and morale more broadly. So you're not just, you know, testing an idea or pressure testing an idea or a process. You're also trying to change the participants who are part of it. And that was one of the things that Andrew Marshall was very famous for. He would identify cohorts and he basically wanted them to be a network. So he'd find a bunch of emerging Air Force 04s and he'd say, you're going to be on this special group and you're going to do this war game. And at the end of it, they were best friends. That was as important as the results of any report they published, right? So there are always other reasons for doing these. The key thing is to make sure they're positive and pro-social and not for malign intent. They're not to sort of whitewash an effort to really, something that really needs to be pressure tested to cover over mistakes and so forth. So the last thing I'll just say is that worse than not doing war games or red teaming at all is doing it and then openly discarding the results. Because when you do that, you signal to all the participants and the wider organization that this is not a place where we welcome challenging dissenting viewpoints and we welcome preventative and creative thinking. Once you signal that, try to get their participation next time, right? Try to get them to think over the horizon next time, they won't do it.
Oh, Bob, your memo about wargaming really implied that there should be some way to assess effectiveness. So I'm interested in your perspective here about how you think about wargaming be effective, and then how should organizations like John Scott is at the Naval War College, how do they think about evaluating themselves in terms of their ability to run and conduct effective war games?
Well, I think you have to start with someone who is a seasoned pro at wargaming and have them look at the war game and ask questions like, what was this game designed to illuminate? So was it designed to study different policy options? Was it designed to illuminate new concepts of operations? Was it designed to assess the capability or the effectiveness of the current force structure? So you start there. Then you have somebody say, okay, how did you design the game to get there? And you have somebody say, yep, the design is consistent with what they're trying to do and is relatively well done. And then what was the nature of the players? And I just want to pick up on what Stacie said in just a second. But again, this would be something that the academic community could do. Now, as the deputy secretary, I relied upon CAPE, who was the keeper of the repository, to inform me on whether or not they believed the games were well designed, well executed, and could be used to make some initial judgments consistent with the problem that the war game was trying to settle. Obviously, the senior leader in the department isn't going to be able to look at the thing and say, I wonder, is this a 90% good war game, or is it, really a piece of trash? you have to have someone who really knows what they're doing to take a look at the war game and say, yes, this thing has been designed well, executed well with good players, all of the things we've talked about. And the other one is if you have a series of war games, which I always think is the best way to go about it, are the series of war games relatively consistent, or is there an outlier? And you don't want to get rid of the outlier. It's like the famous move in the Lisa Dahl Go game, where I think it was called the 10th move or something like that. It was a move that the AI, that AlphaGo did, that no human would ever do. I mean, it was called a once in a million move. And it so confused Lisa Dahl, he literally got up and walked out of the room and going, what the heck is going on? So you don't want to throw out war games that have an outlier. You want to make sure you understand, how did this occur? What is it telling us? Are we missing something? So again, having I think the Department of Defense would do well to establish an independent kind of war game assessor, and that would be really good. It could be RAND. It could be something. It could be the group. I think it's called Connect. Is that the group, the wargaming group that is a bunch of war gamers and academics. They meet constantly. They have little conferences. Maybe they're the ones who could help the department say, look, you're on the wrong track here, or these games really you should pay attention to.
Jackie, could I jump in for a second?
Yeah, definitely. I was going to turn it right to you anyway. So perfect transition.
I'm always, so polite and just interrupt when needed. No, I think, Bob, we've hit on a bunch of different things that are important, but you need to know what your game's goals are. And there's often a sliding scale in terms of softer goals of bringing different communities together, and then people grade themselves, and it can always devolve to, oh, hey, folks had a good time, and they made connections, and that's I don't think good enough, but I think your games need to be graded differently if they're intended to come up with new ideas, if they're supposed to innovate, which is what Bob had really emphasized. You're looking for new concepts that show some viability. You're not going to have really extremely stress tested them yet. It's just sort of initial ideas that you're going to want to take out and further explore, refine, and iterate over time. If you're gaming to break down connections between organizations, which people do all the time, they have time to think about different things. That's a much softer, easier goal, and player experience is important. I do think if you're trying to learn something or test something rigorously, that games player experience is still important, because if they're not engaged and really grappling with the issues you present with them with and taking them seriously, that you're probably not getting the best results. But it is a really hard thing to grade a game, because the reports do a very poor job normally of capturing what went on. And I sometimes think that having full transcripts, sorry, Reed, I know this is what you liked with your work, can be good, but can be very misleading too, because there's a lot of noise in there, and what always happened in the game is sometimes less important than the reasons that people decided to take actions or didn't take actions, and sometimes the paths less not taken or might be yield the insights that are most important. So reports tend to be poor. They're not shared very widely, so it makes it hard to see what went on. And then you also sometimes need to be there to understand some of the interpersonal dynamics and how things went down, though it's impossible, even if you're running a game, if you have different teams in different rooms, to have perfect visibility into everything that's happening all the time. So it's a really tough issue, and I think that the department as a whole and in general, different people need to take it more seriously and come up with some standards for assessing different types of games to help improve the overall quality.
perhaps a defense science board of people like Stacie and Ellie and members of our other panels who could maybe lead in. I think that it would be helpful to have a transition point between what Eric and Reed and I go through, which is the kind of peer review process of academia, which is, arcane in itself, and something that could translate into the national security and Department of Defense about kind of what are rubrics for what is good war games and not good war games and good standards of practice and not. It's a little bit more art than science right now. So I want to shift a little bit to the role that war games play in foreign policy decisions and how they are and can be used as an influential tool in defense decision making. And I'm actually going to start with my co-author, Reed Polly, because Reed has this really lovely article in Foreign Policy that's looking at that traces the impact of games to policy outcomes. So Reed, if you don't mind, can you explain a little bit about what you were arguing and illustrating in the Foreign Policy article?
Sure, thanks very much. So I wrote a piece that was motivated actually just at the beginning of the pandemic by this sort of narrative or question that was emerging in the press at the time about, well, how could we not be prepared for this, right? Doing very quick digging, I thought this was a useful hook for looking at the impact and policy of simulations, right, on policymakers. And so it's not so hard to find out that at the beginning of the Trump administration, there was, as normal in the transition period, a tabletop simulation done with incoming members and outgoing members of administrations, and one of which was, in fact, a simulation of a global pandemic and kind of the preparedness measures, the emergency preparedness tabletop kind of exercise games that we would be familiar with. The issue, right, with learning from that and using it as a jumping off point to be prepared for crisis is that the senior leaders who participated in this game did not last long in the administration and were rapidly replaced by new senior leaders, right? And so I think there's a couple lessons there. We have these jokes about how administration officials in the Trump administration didn't seem to last long in their posts, and that is indeed a vulnerability. But we can also think about this as kind of a lesson about not doing this enough, right, and not having a more consistent training and learning process from simulations. And I was just then bringing in data, what we know historically about cases of the unfortunate lack of learning from war games. We've heard a couple of examples already raised that were fascinating. The one that is most widely known is that during the Vietnam era, there's a series of games run called the Sigma series that were post hoc described as a dry run for the actual thing, that were, while not actually predicting, because war games don't do a great job of prediction, what they were showing is that the current strategy was failing and that there needed to be a reevaluation. And those game results, now historians can go back in the archive and look at how far they made it through the bureaucracy, but those game results did not make it to decision makers in the White House, right? So they were not drawn up the train far enough, right, to challenge the biases, the thinking of policymakers who were implementing current strategy. But we should think about this as a real opportunity to do better, to inform sound foreign policy, right? Because there we also have anecdata about how much players themselves learn and take to their jobs when they go from participating in war games to becoming practitioners. We have anecdata about how much they have learned and how much they seem to appreciate having done these dry runs for the actual thing when a crisis does emerge. So just by way of including some of this anecdata, we have war games that were conducted at MIT in the 50s and 60s, where players were surveyed later on in their careers and asked how much they thought that participating in the MIT games had helped them to do their jobs, and a majority said that they think about them often. In Condoleezza Rice's book with Amy Ziegart, there's a more specific anecdote about how on 9/11, when Secretary Rice was the National Security Advisor, she thought very quickly during the crisis, the morning of September 11th, back on the games she had participated in during the Cold War about crisis communications using the hotline between Moscow and Washington. And she realized that, the president is ordering an airborne alert, and the next thing we need to do is to call Moscow and tell them why we are ordering an airborne alert, right? And communicate with our adversaries in a crisis lest there be misperception. So it's very clear, and I actually think this is the last thing I'll say, is that we need better data than these kind of ad hoc recollections. But if they're any indication, they show that policymakers who participate in simulations take the lessons they learn, and not just if the simulation is a simulacrum of reality for a crisis, but really just to learn lessons about strategic choices in general, right? And so I think that's an exciting opportunity, and this is a great conversation to be had between the folks outside who can run some of these simulations and hopefully get policymakers to participate.
One of the things that is really good for senior policymakers in the government is to put them in a scenario which illuminates the decisions they would have to make under the time constraints they are likely to face. And so I don't know if Stacie saw the same thing, but anytime there was a war game like the invasion of the Baltics, the senior decision makers who came in from the NSC had no clue on how fast they would have to make decisions for us to be able to react. We did a series of war games for space, for example, with the National Security Council in the Trump administration, up to and including Vice President Pence. And, there's not, in some cases, they would say, well, you got to give me more information. And we'd say, look, things that are going on in space are inherently ambiguous. This is what we see. This is what we think is happening. We need you to make a decision. And of course, any senior leader isn't going to like that. They're going to say, well, I got to have more information before I can make a decision. And I'm sorry, you're not going to get any more time. You have to make a decision for gameplay. And then we get to show, did they make the right decision? That really, really helps senior decision makers. We don't do nearly enough of it in the government.
I want to pick up on this because I think both these comments and Reed's comments highlight the extraordinary experiential quality and the teaching quality of participating in games, and how strong that experience can be, and how decision makers take it with them into decisions that they make for the next 20 years. Well, one thing Micah brought up was, and you as well, Bob, was about how Andy Marshall used the power of experience in war games to help build networks of influence. And this is something that I've kind of been very interested in. So I'd like to hear from your perspective, Bob. I talked to you a little about this when we had a conversation a while ago for the book that Julia McDonald and I are writing. And I had one a little bit later with Michael Vickers about the 20 XX games. And I'm interested from your perspective, how the design of games and the choosing and the selection of players, how that also becomes a way to influence policy.
And this gets to, I was actually going to make the point, but I forgot to do it. The first 20XX games were failures. What happened is we brought in what we consider to be the best operators from the Air Force and the Navy and the Marine Corps and the Army. And we said, okay, we want you to envision this world with where precision strike capabilities had widely proliferated. How will this change the way that you operate? And it was just too hard for them. They had, they were generally 04, 05s. They had 10 to 20 years of experience. And generally what they did is they just replicated the experience that they were familiar with, but with some new cool things. And what we finally had to do is we said, look, we are going to build a game book. Now, there are some connoisseurs of war games that would probably say, hey, this isn't the best thing. But we actually made game books which described in some level of detail the systems that would be consistent with a world where precision strike, battle networks, and guided munitions were widely proliferated. We would give them to the players ahead of the game and require them to read them. And then when they came in, they were much more able to immerse themselves in that world and come up with new operational concepts. So sometimes, especially when you're trying to say, we need to think anew, there are things changing, you've got to think creatively on how you can get the players to get there. And your point on Andrew Marshall really wanted to have 04s and 05s play, because his thinking was, if we can inculcate these players with the type of thinking that you would need to have to fight and survive and win in this world, when they became general officers, they would be prepared and much better to be able to lead the forces. So it was all about building, like you said, the cadre of people who were like-minded and inculcated in ideas that were likely to come about. So building that cadre of people in the world that you're trying to explore is really, really important.
Well, Micah, do you think red teaming has the same experiential qualities as wargaming? And then I've seen recently a lot of use of war games as some sort of kind of valid data point for DoD policies, right? So like the Air Force says, oh, we need more, F-35s. Look at this war game that we ran, right? And people seem to take a lot of credibility on wargaming data. Do you think that the same kind of credibility comes out of red teaming outputs? So I'd love to hear kind of the differences and similarities between the two.
Yeah, the only time like a red teaming result gets leaked to the press is for intent. And it's rarely for the goal of sort of telling what actually happened. And unless you know the design, unless you know what they were intended to review, what was supposed to be pressure tested, you should be very skeptical. And this is true even of physical or cyber pen testing, which is people trying to break into allegedly defended network systems. They never fail, and they'll say like, well, there was this vulnerability at this location or this computer network. It's like, no kidding. The vulnerability probably starts with the people who were at the guard or the people who wrote the software code, right? I mean, most vulnerabilities are internal to an organization, not external. So I'm always very skeptical when I see red team results and people, I send them my way. So again, unless you know what the intent was, be very skeptical of the results. But people do weaponize the results undoubtedly to drive home a point. I always say the way you get people to care about your emergency management plan is to burn down the building across the street. And when you don't have a spare building to burn down, a simulation that gave the appearance of something that catastrophic, that consequential, that vivid, can make senior leaders change the way they think about a problem and be more susceptible to certain policy outcomes than they would have been otherwise.
Yeah, Eric and I are both Air Force reservists, and I think it's been probably etched in both of our brains the famous Air Force demonstration of the power of strategic bombing by taking out an aircraft carrier. But I think Eric also could attest that the Air Force has been remarkable at remarkably strategic about the way they declassify and publicize Wargame that support whatever kind of the service's core objectives might be. Now, Stacie, you worked for the Air Force in a lot of these RAND games. And so you saw directly the way the work that you were doing was influencing the Air Force decision-making. And so I was interested kind of your perspective as well on how these games influenced or didn't influence different Air Force decision-making.
I mean, they definitely do. And they influence different people. People can play in the exact same game and take away different lessons from it, right? And that's one of the challenges with gaming sometimes is folks will walk away with different perspectives on what happened. The power of the games helps to sometimes convince skeptical audiences that there's a problem or that they're going to face a challenge in a particular situation. And I always think back to games that Bob may have actually run. I don't know who ran these. It was a CSBA ran collaboration for Pacific Vision 08, where they convinced then, I think, General Chandler that aircraft parked at Okinawa Air Base were vulnerable to ballistic missile attack, and that it was the fact that he participated and was there and saw that what could happen, that it influenced and changed his mind and should have driven more outcomes, but it didn't actually always. So I think that games can influence, but there's so much analysis that goes on and so many different types of games, and some of them are intended to influence the budget and the program and others are not. Some are supposed to be, you know, innovative, thinking about the next generation of systems you want to be developing and the new type of concepts, futures games instead of current ones. So the Air Force has certainly tried to use games because they've run into resistance on the Hill. And I think games can be a very useful sort of communications tool or socialization way of socializing ideas, because when you play in it, you have that story living experience, as my colleague Ed McGrady likes to say, and it's very powerful. But it's hard to get people to play, to actually have the time to play in games. So the selective invoking of war games is just, you know, trying to help them to put forward the programs that they think that are needed, and to, in some ways, impress upon key audiences and stakeholders who control the purse, especially on the Hill, that change is needed and that, like, we can't just keep doing what we are right now in terms of the Air Force. So the Air Force has used games to come up with new ways of operating and to think about doing things very differently, like Bob was talking about earlier, more unmanned systems, perhaps fewer manned fighter aircraft that are in, and how they can figure out how to effectively project combat power in a very heavily contested environment. But I feel like it's done in a very haphazard way, and all the services, you know, they might invoke the joint warfighting concept or game and different things, and because there's a lack of transparency and we don't have all of the information, that audiences are still sometimes skeptical. You can get sort of the dramatic aspect of the games. You know, you have my former colleague Dave Eichmann saying we get our asses handed to us, and I think this is a reference to the Air Force's games. And that helps to impress upon the need to do something, but it's pretty, you know, ad hoc at this point.
I want to highlight something that which is different than in defense than the academic side. And for this, I want to turn to my colleague, Eric Greenberg. In the academic sphere, we have to run or go through what's called an institutional review board when we run war games, because war games are inherently behavioral phenomenon in which people are interacting and we are collecting on their actions. We, as you know, scholars and researchers, have an ethical obligation to let players know if we're using the war games to influence, or if the treatment is going to have potentially a negative effect on them. But Department of Defense war games don't go through an IRB. So I was interested from your perspective, Eric, because you've worked with DoD Wargames and you've also kind of gone through this ethical process in the academic side. Is there an ethical obligation if people are designing war games to influence? And should the DoD have a responsibility to think through the ethics of wargaming?
That's a great question. I think there's actually two elements to ethics, right? When I think about the IRB traditionally, I think about ethics of human subjects research. So making sure I'm not causing any kind of undue harm to participants that are participating in research. And so that I think is really the goal of the IRB on that perspective. But there's a second element of ethics, and that is, what are we doing with the data that comes out of those games? And in some cases, the IRB isn't necessarily regulating how a researcher is going to analyze or interpret their findings. And I think we see in some cases a closer parallel there to what's happening in policy games, right? As many of the speakers have said, end customers might selectively interpret game findings. They might design games in certain ways to push forward certain agendas. And so to the degree that an IRB might be able to help that, I'm not really sure it would. I think what would actually help this is something that gets back to Deputy Secretary Work's comments from earlier about additional degrees of oversight. So allowing external actors to come in and to evaluate the findings of the game to say, okay, does the raw data actually support the conclusions that the sponsor or the report is actually putting out? Or are they essentially selecting on certain variables, or are they biasing certain types of things? I think back to kind of earlier points, though, there's challenges in doing this, right? Many academics don't have the security clearances needed to look at this game data. And perhaps those that do have an institutional background, right? They served in the military previously, they work at an FFRDC or something of that nature. So I think it's an important question. I'm not sure there's a great solution in my mind.
Yeah, I think that this is a really good example of where the ethical obligations are very different. And yet this core idea about being responsible with data and understanding the inherent biases of data is really important. And I also think we're coalescing around some sort of, defense science board kind of outside organization that maybe some of the people on this panel could serve on. So I want to go to one of the questions from the audience, and I'm going to kind of manipulate it a little bit. There was a question in the audience about the metaverse. And this actually comes up a lot in gaming, not just about the metaverse, but like what is the medium through which gaming occurs? Is tabletop gaming, is that gaming? Is if we're playing a computer game or we're using a computer interface, is that gaming? So I'm interested from you guys' perspective, what role does the interface through which people are engaging affect war games or red teaming? And I'll start with Micah.
Yeah, everyone learned this about 2 years and 2 months ago when all the work we were doing in person primarily became virtual. And it was fascinating, experiment to learn what is the different way that you change conversations in forced remote environments. Like we learned, for example, that because there's a clock on the lower right-hand corner of everyone's screen, conversations end on time. People actually are obsessed with the clock that you don't see normally when you're in a room with each other. There's also a lot more social loafing among participants in virtual settings because they can have their camera on or off. They can choose to engage or not engage. You have to literally force and compel people to be participants through lots of different mechanisms. So there were lots of changes to it. But the more interesting thing was that we got the information and the data faster. Normally we would do these sorts of activities, these exercises, in large group in-person settings, use whiteboards, use a lot of collect papers, 3x5 stickies, everything you would envision. But when you do it virtually, you actually get the raw data, the quantifiable data back from participants faster. And we could build findings and recommendation reports faster. We could create matrices. We create a lot of risk matrices based upon the information people provide on identifiable, probable, and severe risks. So we were able to do things faster, but you lost some of the connectivity, the body language reading that we're all deeply aware of, the what they call persistent eye gaze fatigue that we're all experiencing probably right at this moment. So that was a different aspect of it virtually, and nobody would have known this, right, in case we had been forced to do it. So, you know, never let a crisis go to waste.
And Bob, you've probably experienced a lot of different types of mediums when you've been through wargaming. Do you think that it matters what the medium or the interface is?
I much prefer in-person games because, as Stacie said, the dynamic among the players is very, very important to observe and to say. For example, in many war games where there's a general officer on a team, everybody starts to defer to the general officer. And what the team essentially provides is what the general officer or flag officer thinks. And so being able to understand that, see the dynamics, how are they coming to a decision? Is it a true consensus decision? To me, that is always ideal. I personally have never participated in a war game that was primarily virtual. I just haven't done, so I don't have a lot of experience in that regard.
Stacie, you've run virtual games. I know you've done tabletop games. I know you've read all of the back and forth about hexes and all the icons. And so I'm sure you have some ideas about what works, what doesn't, what matters, what doesn't.
I mean, it depends what you're trying to do. So at different points in time, you know, virtual has the advantage of bringing people together and that are maybe in different locations that they otherwise wouldn't be able to make it. The commander of Indo-Pacific Command can be talking to people in DC if they get up early. But I do tend to fall along Bob's views of liking impersonal games, in part because I personally just have trouble paying attention anymore when I'm in a virtual environment too long. And I think a lot of people are facing challenges like that. There are other benefits too. You know, you get the transcript of chat. You can have information in terms of what all of the interactions are. It's already recorded. You can just take it right there. You can record the games more easily. So there are benefits, but I haven't run any actually, well, other than in my classes, I haven't run any computer games where it's really just what you imagine with like people do for entertainment. And you know, that's in part because we're normally doing things on timelines where we need to produce a game and execute it more quickly than you can actually build a good interface and computer platform to run it. And there are technical challenges, as I know Andrew and his crew experienced. You know, it's just glitchy, and that can be annoying. So the nice thing about tabletop games or just seminar games or people in a room talking is that you don't have, if the technology doesn't cooperate with you, you have a fail-safe, you can move forward, but you do have to know the rules. And computer games, you know, can adjudicate it for you, though it's a black box. I tend to like, because it's about the players interacting with each other oftentimes and having that discussion and debate. Ultimately, whatever they choose to do is what I'm often most interested in. I like them to be in the room. I like there to be pieces. It might, even for non-combat games where they just have different things that represent and help to hold them accountable because they don't have infinite amounts of different resources, but it helps them to plan, to be engaged, to participate in it. I don't like PowerPoint games, which a lot of people do, where you spend all of your time filling in forms. That it could make sense in certain circumstances. Terminals, I think they do this at the Naval War College for command and control exercises. So the platform, you know, it varies which one is the best suited for a situation. But I guess in contrast to what most people assume, where everybody only plays or mostly plays video games today, I think that the manual tabletop games are actually better in most of these circumstances for serious games.
So I think what's interesting there is that sometimes the use of terminals or the PowerPoint is as much a data collection device as it is like a mechanism for the game. And so, but it creates, there are kind of externalities. So at the Naval War College, we do have terminals, and we actually have a pretty, or I'm not there anymore, but we had a very extensive kind of game net setup, which helped with realism. But sometimes it meant people were like heads down typing. So you didn't have a lot of engagement kind of in the room. But post hoc, it's great because I'm grabbing all the data, all the texting that's happening between players. I can grab all that. Whereas, and Eric knows this because Eric and I have both served as ethnographers in these games, that when you're trying to write down what everyone's saying, it's almost impossible. And in a classified environment, it's very, very hard to record. So the mechanism also is driven by data collection. I want to do one final question, and this is from one of our viewers, and it brings up something that Eric alluded to. And he asks, given that programs and capabilities are often classified, and these games are often classified, how can DoD bridge or use academia to try and help innovate in war games? If anybody has any ideas about how we can overcome the classification burden. And I will say also, kind of because Reed works on archival data, there is a deficit of this wargaming data because the process of declassification, especially right now, is so burdensome and so behind that a lot of this data is not actually ending up in unclassified archives. And it's unclear also whether organizations are archiving appropriately before declassification. So now that we've moved to the digital world, there's a really good chance that a lot of this game data just disappears, especially off networks that are not that are kind of standalone networks. So anyway, that's a long preamble for do you see any like way that we can overcome this barrier?
I think that's really hard. I mean, there's sort of, I would say, a broader issue of overclassification that often occurs and makes it difficult. If the department actually makes strides on improving its IT infrastructure and with data sharing, then maybe it might be easier to do this. But even, the CAPE repository, getting access to it requires extra permissions, and everyone's supposed to turn in their reports. I don't think everyone does, and they're of varying quality. So relying on the professional military education schools like the Naval Postgraduate School, the Naval War College, Maxwell, different places like that could be one way to bring in academics who also will have clearances. But more broadly, I don't know what the department should do. I do think there should be more unclassified games, and that's one of the things that we do at CNAS. And one of our, I think, value adds is that we can take the best of our knowledge and do things unclassified, which has limitations, but being on the outside, it allows us to talk about things differently and to examine questions and feed into the public discussion. But I don't have a solution to the overclassification problem. Maybe somebody smarter than I does.
I don't have a solution for overclassification, but in this case, if the department said, say for example, the DSB was designated by the deputy secretary as, hey, you're going to be responsible for kind of adjudicating or analyzing or assessing the quality of games. And the DSB could then set up a special committee, and people could be brought on as SGEs, special government employees. They could be given a collateral clearance, and it would be clunky, and it wouldn't be as fast as everybody would want, but it's doable. And you would probably want to get a committee of, say, 100 academics or wargaming experts. And for any given game, you might only need 3 to conduct an assessment. So you'd always have a pool available from which to draw from. Now you'd have to judge the size of the pool against the demand of all the different war games. But this is something certainly that would be doable.
What about when they invoke the SAP, capability that is actually going to win the war that we just don't know about? Because that's always the people go up a level. No, I think it's a good idea, Bob.
Yeah,
I'm just kidding.
Your point is, yeah, I mean, solving the SAP problem would be almost impossible.
Yeah, we'll also have to pay the academics very well, because as Reed and Eric know full well, especially in the assistant professor kind of like tenure track years, there are not a lot of incentives for academics to do this kind of work, because it takes away from the ability, especially since none of this can be published, it takes away from the things that you do on your CV that actually get you tenure. I think sometimes the Department of Defense maybe doesn't appreciate how difficult it can be for academics to do this kind of work that they get no credit for. So I'm going to do really, really quickly a lightning round just for a few minutes. And these are really tough questions that are very short answers. Eric and Reed, I'd like to bring you in. Okay. Who does wargaming best in the DoD? Stacie, we'll start with you.
I don't know. I don't feel qualified to answer that because I've only seen a bias sample. Yeah, I would say Brand, my former organization for DoD, was one of the best.
Micah?
I was actually going to address the earlier question, which relates to this one, and breaking the barrier between classified and unclassified. As someone who is in the unclassified world completely, and is no longer on any academic track, is I am brought in for the last 3 administrations to talk to White House, State Department, DoD, various command people who want to leverage any insights I can provide them. I give them all of my facilitation guides. I ask for nothing, like other than a sandwich and a Diet Coke, and am willing to work with them to design any sort of game or any sort of experience they want. And it is amazing, freely given advice for which on the private sector side of things, we get ridiculous amount of money. Like, people are resistant because of classification, even not even the classified issues, even just bestowing the tools for how people could apply them. It's almost impossible. So I wouldn't even know who does wargaming best, because I don't see any of the wargaming entities who really leverage social science or practitioners in any honest way.
I agree. Bob?
No, I'm with Stacie. I don't think I would be able to pick. I mean, there are, the FFRDCs like RAND, CNA are quite good. All of the service war colleges are quite good, depending on if they have the time and the curriculum to actually conduct war games. But I wouldn't be able to tell you who I think is the best.
Eric?
I'm going to give you another unsatisfying answer, and it's going to be, it depends on the scope of the war game.
I should have asked who does it worse. Reed?
Yeah, as another non-DoDer, I'm going to give a pitch for who is doing the most exciting designing of their own war games right now that I know, and that's Jackie and Eric, who are my co-authors on this exciting paper. Go read the EJIR paper for all of the really creative ideas they have about how to design games for maximal learning.
Okay, I'm going to give one last question. All right. You all get one line in the NDAA to invest in DoD war games. What do you invest in? I'll start with Bob.
If they still have it, we had a wargaming incentive fund. It was a fund. It was a fund that would, if the services came up and said, "Look, we'd like to do this game. It's consistent with the national defense strategy in this way, but we just don't have the funds." And they'd say if we could have $200,000, we'd be able to really design and execute a well-run game. And we established that. I don't know if it's still in existence. I think it is, but it was designed to incentivize the services to do war games that would illuminate aspects of the national defense strategy. So I would ask the Congress to fund a wargaming incentive fund for the Department of Defense.
I like it. And let's add a part of the incentive fund that's for academics to do research. Stacie.
I would fund a sort of curriculum and invest in people to train them to design and run good war games. It ends up being one of the biggest limiting factors, is because folks who don't know what they're doing sometimes end up running games. So as a part of that, training people in how to conduct war games that follow good research design principles and game design principles, and then also establish some criteria for helping to evaluate them afterwards.
Micah.
I mean, related to that, after 18 years of being open, last year, the Pentagon closed Red Team University at Fort Leavenworth, largely because I thought the Army had done enough critical thinking and they could put an end to it. Unfortunately, there is no part of the PME system that teaches divergent and critical thinking at all, even though everyone recognizes we need to instill those capabilities within our officer corps. So on the current path, you're going to see hundreds of thousands of new Mandarin speakers who can't think for themselves. And I think if you could invest just in literally divergent, critical, creative thinking for officers, that would be the single biggest impact.
All right, so I'm going to go ahead and just hand it over to Reed to close. So I know we're at time.
Great. Thank you for this. This has been a fantastic discussion and has complemented our other series, webinars very well. I just want to close this by thanking Hoover for being our hosts, thanking MIT SSP and the Brown Watson Institute for co-sponsoring these events. This is the end of the series of webinars, but this is not the end of the effort. So we invite you to continue to engage with us on Twitter, at seminars, at various events in the future. Send us emails and read the EJIR paper that is in the chat. Just a quick note on that, it's gonna be behind a paywall next week, so download it today. So in this series, we've talked about historical games, archival research, we've talked about experimental games and how to design war games. And today we talked about the critical importance of war games for policymaking. And on each of those scores, there is more research to be done. So please join us in that effort as we continue this research. Thank you everyone for being here.